one thing I like to recommend to my clients is to see a pelvic floor physio at about 20 weeks of pregnancy, and then again around 35 weeks. And that way the pelvic floor physio can do an internal exam and they can let you know like what the status quo is of your pelvic floor, because it would be good to know, like, do you have too tight of a pelvic floor? Like maybe you're an athlete, maybe you're a gymnast, or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you need to work on tone. So that can help you determine.
Welcome to the Becky Choi's podcast show. Thank you so much for tuning in. And today we have a special guest here, Nikki Johnston, who is a pregnancy and postpartum fitness coach. And she is the creator of the Babes and Bellies Bootcamp. Now, if you are somebody who is pregnant or you're newly just gave birth, this is a really good episode for you. And if you have mommy friends who are pregnant and just giving birth, I think this is definitely something you should share with them, because I have the expert here. We can share a lot of tips to help you with different things during pregnancy and how you can mitigate or reduce that diastasis recti we all wanted to. So let's get started. I'm so happy to have you, Nikki.
Thank you so much for having me, Becky. I really am stoked to be here.
Yeah. So tell me, maybe before we get started on some of the questions that we have for our audience here, do you mind just give a brief introductions about you and who you are and what do you do?
Yeah, so my name is Nikki Johnston. I'm a pregnancy and postpartum fitness coach, as you said. I work with clients who are both pregnant and postpartum, and I work with them in a bunch of different capacities. I teach a Prepare to Push workshop, which is a sort of like a prenatal fitness style workshop, and I work with them one-on-one in personal training. I also have some online programs, as you mentioned, the Babes and Bellies Bootcamp. I have in-person classes, so I see moms who are pregnant and both postpartum, all the way from 6 or 8 weeks until like about a year old. So that's sort of in a nutshell what I do. And I got into teaching and doing pre and postnatal work before I even had my son, and I was always super interested in just the female body and how it worked. But then when I became pregnant, it's a totally different experience when you go through it yourself. So I definitely dug into a lot more research about what I could do to prepare my body for labor, kind of thinking of birth as the marathon. You'd never go into a marathon without training for it, right? So what could I do to prepare my body for birth so that I could feel both strong and supple going into it? And so I took a lot of courses. I listened to a lot of evidence-based podcasts about what I wanted during my birth. I had a doula, and I had midwives, and I really felt like that whole research process and then the background that I had as a pre and postnatal fitness specialist kind of helped give me like a pretty positive birth experience, despite the fact that my son came 6 weeks early. And so we were in the NICU with him for about 3 weeks because he was premature. Mm-hmm. So I really felt that I wanted to be able to offer everything that I learned during my pregnancy to other women out there. So that's kind of where I am today. Just want to help serve women as much as possible and empower them with lots of knowledge during their pregnancy.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing. And I feel like we have a lot in comments because you do a lot with mamas who are pregnant and I guess early in that postpartum stage. And I mainly help clients who are newly postpartum or like usually maybe 2 to 3 years postpartum who have diastasis. So we kind of overlap that whole period of pregnancy to like early postpartum. So which is really good. And I love to have you maybe help me understand, have a discussions around during pregnancy, what are maybe probably some of the tips to help with having the most optimum pregnancy. Maybe we can also touch point on how we can help you mitigate diastasis recti. Can it be preventable? So something we can touch point on. But first of all, maybe let's talk about posture and alignment. Because I feel like, and when I was second trimester in my pregnancy, after having my first son, I started to have a lot of back pain. And that back pain just continued to keep going on and on until I gave birth. And then the second time with my daughter, it was just like I felt like my back was going to snap in half, like by the end of the pregnancy, because I carried on both of them to almost 40 weeks. Just 40 weeks. And it was just like, oh my God. So how can we mitigate that pain? Like how is posture and alignment so important for that?
Yeah, so such a good question. So if you kind of picture your abdomen as like a can or a barrel, if you think of the top of the can is your diaphragm and the bottom of the can is your pelvic floor, and those two things work in synergy together, as you know. So you can imagine them working together as a jellyfish. So as a jellyfish swims up, you're inhaling and then it descends. So it kind of moves up and down like that. And then either sides of the barrel or the can are the front would be, your corset, your transverse ab muscles, and then the back would be your multifidus. So those are what we kind of call the four deep core main muscles. And so they are working optimally in alignment when they're working optimally when they are in alignment. And that just means that they're stacked nicely one on top of the other. So you're thinking about stacking your rib cage over your hips. And it is a little bit more complex than that, but that's kind of how you should have. That's kind of optimal alignment in a nutshell. And so as soon as that alignment is a little bit off, it compromises your core function, as you know, with diastasis. So I believe that posture and alignment is a tool and not a rule. I don't think that we should necessarily be forcing everybody into it, but I think it's important for mamas to kind of be aware of what their posture is like and to work on it throughout the day, because I do think that what we do outside of our exercise or fitness routine actually maybe has even more of an impact than that maybe like half hour to an hour we spend on exercise during the day. So thinking about how are you standing, how are you walking, even how are you pooping, because that can have a lot of pressure on the pelvic floor. So I like to so I kind of teach my ladies how to kind of assume an optimal posture, but also I do an assessment to decide, okay, do you have an anterior pelvic tilt? Do you have a posterior pelvic tilt? Are you really rounded through the shoulders? Is your upper back stretched out? And all of those things to kind of give them some little tips to how they can carry themselves a little bit differently throughout the day so that they can kind of have that optimal alignment and posture throughout their pregnancy as much as possible under the growing weight of the baby.
Right. And what would you say, like, let's say by the third trimester, your belly is just like a watermelon and your back will tend to arch no matter what. How is it possible to really stack that, right? For our audience to really understand, how can you really stack the ribs to the hips when your belly is like all carrying front facing, which is very common for my niche of clients. Most of the weight, baby weights are carrying in the front. How can we align better?
Mm-hmm. I think there's some really simple kind of tips that you can do throughout the day. So for instance, when you're sitting, I like to recommend that you don't stay sitting all day long. So if you're a desk worker, you make a point of like setting a little timer on your phone. So you get up and walk around every 20 minutes, you go get some water in the kitchen, you go to the bathroom, you move around. Like none of us are meant to sit all day long. And especially during pregnancy, because that's going to lock out your hips. We really want to maintain mobility in the pelvis. Another thing you can do in sitting is also have a stability ball or a fitness ball with you and sit on the ball. And that doesn't have to be all day, but just switch out your chair with your stability ball. So I like to teach my clients to do pelvic rocking. So pelvic rocking is just kind of a term that we use to trace like circles with our hips on the ball. You can go back and forth, forward and back, so that you're, again, getting mobility in the hips and you're not just staying in that one position. And then the other thing too you can do is actually prop your bum up. So if you're sitting on a chair, you can roll up a towel or sit on a pool noodle or something like that, just to give yourself a little bit of elevation. And that can relieve a little bit of the pressure from your hips because it's tilting you forward ever so slightly. So there's a few different tips. Those are some kind of basic sitting tips. Insofar as something like sleeping, sleeping can be a little bit uncomfortable in pregnancy, but we also want to try to keep everything in alignment as much as possible. So I would recommend that you have like a little belly under your pillow, and then you also have a pillow both under your knees and under your ankles, so that your knees and ankles are at the same kind of plane. And then you can also have another one that you're kind of hugging if you're on your side, because as we know, a lot of women aren't comfortable on their backs. Yeah.
Yeah,
so
I
that's
used
just
to
a
have
little
a really long pillow to hug it.
Yeah, it's comfortable, right? So those are a few ways that you can think about, just ways to like stand and sleep during the day
to align better. And I get it, because your hip is supposed to be moving around. Now you're not supposed to be sitting all day, and that's where you're gonna get a weak glutes when you're constantly sitting. Let's say moms are having to do a desk job and they're sitting all day at home doing in front of the computer. So you can imagine that the hips it's losing that function, like losing that muscle tone. And I guess what you're saying, if if they could try to sit on a stability ball, that would be really helpful for them to rotate around, right, while working.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too is that when you're sitting, it means that your psoas and your hip flexors are in a contracted and shortened position, and it means that the back of your glutes or your posterior chain is in a lengthened position. So that can also mean that there's a bit of imbalance and weakness there. So that's why, as you said, it's super important during pregnancy and postpartum to train the glutes too, to make sure that we maintain some strength in the posterior chain too. And that's, of course, not a strong and fast rule for everybody. Everyone's going to be a bit different, but it tends to be like a pretty common thing that I see with my clients, and I'm sure you do too, when they sit all day long.
Absolutely. When you have a strong glute, strong butt, you're going to have a strong core. They are correlated for sure.
Totally. The butt glutes totally help to support the core. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's why I tell my clients to work on squatting, lunging, to really help building those muscles back. And even though they might not seem to be necessarily related to diastasis or that core weakness, but because you need to have a strong glute in order to have a strong core, it's so important for you to work on the legs, work on the butt.
And not only that, the side benefit is that the glutes are one of the largest muscle groups in the body. So when you work the glutes, you're basically burning more calories.
That we all
just
have
a side benefit. But the last point I did want to make is also about, I'm sure you've heard of the squatty potty, right? Do you know what a squatty potty is?
It's like raised with the like a stool that you put your feet on while you go.
Exactly. Yeah. When you're on the toilet. So we're actually meant, that is like optimal pooping alignment, basically being in a squat position. So I have stools and a squatty potty in my bathroom so that I assume that position, because you're actually bearing down less on the pelvic floor that way. And you're kind of lining everything up. So that can be like a really good trick also during pregnancy.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking with pelvic floor, let's talk about the second questions we sort of have here is, why is it so important to be able to learn how to strengthen or how to relax our pelvic floor will help to train the core to function better?
Yeah. So as I kind of mentioned before, the pelvic floor is a very important part. It's part of the core four. So of course, it's not only about the pelvic floor, but it's important to there's lots of different terms for it, but the most common term is doing your Kegels, but I like to call it, pelvic floor contractions or the core breath. So learning how to do your pelvic floor contractions with diaphragmatic breathing, so that you can, when you're strengthening your pelvic floor, you're also toning your transverse abs, which is a key muscle for pushing. And so we want to basically have a pelvic floor that is both strong and supple. So it's kind of like, your biceps. If you're doing a bicep curl, but you don't have full range of motion because you're too tight, well, then you're not going to be fully like able to contract and relax that muscle, right? So we also want to be able to learn to relax the pelvic floor too. And so that's also when you're doing your core breath, which I'm sure you also teach, you want to learn to relax on the inhale too.
Right. Yeah.
So one thing I like to recommend to my clients is to see a pelvic floor physio at about 20 weeks of pregnancy, and then again around 35 weeks. And that way the pelvic floor physio can do an internal exam, and they can let you know like what the status quo is of your pelvic floor, because it would be good to know, like, do you have too tight of a pelvic floor? Like maybe you're an athlete, maybe you're a gymnast, or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you need to work on tone. So that can help you determine, are you strengthening, or are we working on trying to like release a little bit more?
Yes. I love that. I wish somebody would have told me to see a physio while I was pregnant. It's more like, oh, go see a massage therapist because you have back pain, so they will feel better. But I never, I mean, now I'm not pregnant, but like so nobody told me would go to see a physio when I was 20 weeks or 35 weeks. Actually, that's a really good point. If they are able to assess what kind of strength or what kind of tone you have with your pelvic floor, it'll be so much easier for you to understand postnatally what kind of things, what kind of where to begin, because we start from the pelvic floor, and knowing that, okay, if you're too tight, we need to relax it, stretch it, and do some massages there. Or if it's too loose, how can we make it stronger so then your core is actually going to work with you better? And that this is one of the key of preventing diastasis, it's starting from your pelvic floor. And so glad that you're mentioning this, Nikki.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to note the reason why a pelvic floor physio would be so handy to see at about 20 weeks of pregnancy is so that they can get baseline information, right?
Yes.
So that they know, like, as you said, once you are 6 weeks postpartum and you're doing that exam, they know where you've come from. And that's valuable information for them too.
Yeah. And I noticed, maybe I don't know if you can discuss about that. It's like a cesarean birth versus a vaginal birth. Would that have any impact on the pelvic floor strength and tone?
I think that there's a common myth that if you have a C-section, you don't have to worry about your pelvic floor because the baby clearly didn't come out through the vaginal canal.
Yeah.
And full disclosure, I didn't have a C-section. I delivered vaginally, but my understanding is that you're still carrying a baby for 9 months, assuming you're carrying the baby to term. So that's still going to have an impact on your pelvic floor as well. So there is still some work to be done, probably not as much necessarily as someone who delivered vaginally, but it all really depends on how the birth went. And that's what I hear from the pelvic floor physios that I speak to is, it's hard to kind of say a hard and fast rule about one,
Yes.
like a person who had a C-section versus a person who had a vaginal birth. It really depends on what happened during the birth. But I think it is safe to say that just because you had a C-section doesn't mean there is no work to do with the pelvic floor. And as you know, like if you have a C-section, that is like a major surgery to your abdomen, right? And we know that the abdomen and core is connected to the pelvic floor. It's not a separate entity. So I still believe that there is like work to be done there if you've had a C-section.
Yeah, I totally agree. And is there, since we're touching on C-section, is there any way for moms who are wanting to have a vaginal birth and not gonna have to go through C-section? Is there? I mean, I had a vaginal birth too, but I gave birth at home unintentionally.
Did you?
And
Wow.
I think it was just too late to get to the hospital. But the pushing the baby took me 2.5 hours out because he was in angle.
Okay.
And I had a midwife with me at that time at home, and she literally, they put her fingers into kind of like turn the baby around to pick her. But I felt like if I were at the hospital at that stage, I think I would have a C-section, but I had no choice at home. I had to push him out. But so in your practice, would your clients be like, oh, I really don't want to have a cesarean birth. How can I have a vaginal birth?
I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is that I try to keep within my scope of practice, and my scope of practice is to be like a pregnancy and postpartum fitness coach. And I feel like getting into the C-section versus vaginal birth thing, that is something that is like in some ways a little bit out of my control. I'm not a doula and I'm not a midwife. So I kind of try to stay away from that. Yeah, I think that one thing though is that's important is to kind of have that conversation with your midwife and your doula to kind of know what you want and be able to advocate for yourself during birth and have them be able to advocate for you when you're in like one of the most vulnerable positions, you might ever be in your life.
Very vulnerable.
Yeah. So I think it's good, like you said, to kind of be on the same page. Like your midwife knew what you wanted, right? So, but at a certain point, there's also safety concerns too. So
exactly. Yeah. Would like fitness or strength training throughout pregnancy would be able to help you go into labor easier?
Yeah. So I kind of think about, I mean, first of all, I like to advocate for women staying fit and staying healthy during pregnancy for a couple of reasons. So one is just that, if you continue to stay active during your pregnancy, you will be able to return to postpartum activities a little bit easier afterwards. You won't be totally starting all over again. That doesn't mean you're going to bounce back, but it means that you might find it a little bit easier. So that's one. Number two is I also think that staying active can help mitigate gestational diabetes. Some people will get it anyways, but it can certainly help mitigate it, even doing like going for walks after dinner, that kind of thing. And then third, I think about training for birth. So using the principle of specificity. So that's one thing that we kind of teach in the Prepare to Push workshop. So basically doing movements that can help you be strong when you're actually assuming certain labor positions. So doing your squats, doing like exercise and movements on all fours, doing side lying positions, that kind of thing. And then the other important point too that I kind of touched on earlier was also making sure you're engaging and strengthening the transverse abs, because that's a key muscle for pushing as well.
And what do you say if the moms are just getting really tired by the end of the second trimester or third trimester and they don't have the energy to do much of the strength training or workouts? What would you recommend for that?
Yeah. And so I hear that a lot with my clients. A lot of women are nauseous, they're exhausted, they're totally wiped. So in my Babes and Bellies bootcamp program, I specifically design videos that are very short that women can do at home. And they can do short pelvic floor workouts. They can do short deep core workouts. A lot of it is kind of mat work. And then there's also full body routines that you can do at home. And they're like 15 to 30 minutes. So it's sort of designed for women who maybe don't have optimal energy. But if you do have great energy and you want to do more, there's always ways for you to do more. So I would say, on the one hand, like, honor your body. If you're exhausted, take your naps and everything. But I also do like to recommend that women do take like the 5 to 10 minutes to do the short, at least pelvic floor and deep core workouts that I really think will benefit them.
Simple things like that, 5 to 10 minutes every day. And I understand what you're saying, like the deep core work or breathing. It's very simple. Like if it's a Kegel, it's more like mentally to contract the muscles. Then you actually physically lift the weights or punch or doing some cardio and stuff like that. So I would say that, would you agree, doing exercise like that plus walking, having a daily walk would be very helpful?
Yeah.
Like you can't do anything else.
Yeah. And I should say that, like, when I talk about my pelvic floor workouts, it's not just sitting here and doing Kegels. Like, I really like to integrate movement with it too. So I want people to know that there's ways of doing and exercising the pelvic floor with movement, so that you're not just sitting there doing Kegels, which, let's be honest, is really boring, right?
It is. I do remember my doctor, was it my midwife maybe? Yeah, told me about that. And then I tried. I'm like, seriously, this is going to work? What am I doing?
Yeah. And also the other thing too is, like, it's not necessarily functional, right? Like, think about what you're doing as a mom throughout the day. You are constantly, like, you're going to be picking up your baby. You're going to be picking up a laundry basket. You're going to be picking up your car seat, right? So it's like learning how to integrate the pelvic floor contractions and the breath with those functional daily movements is going to be super helpful too.
Yeah, absolutely. It is definitely about functional, and we need to be functional in order to welcome this new baby and face all the challenges that come with it.
Totally.
Yeah. So any final comments that you wanted to add to our listeners or our audience here who are maybe pregnant, maybe or newly postpartum? Yeah, what would you say to them in terms of where to get started?
I mean, first, I would just say congratulations. And if you're feeling exhausted and nauseous, that's totally okay and totally normal. I hear it all the time. And if you want to know where to get started, you can always feel free to reach out to me, and I can offer you a few resources. You can join a Prepare to Push workshop, and I can help you kind of get on your way. And just remember that when you are trying to stay fit in pregnancy, it's really not about, hitting any personal records or anything. You're really just trying to maintain your fitness. So you're not necessarily pushing yourself. You're not necessarily getting your heart rate up super high. You're just kind of trying to maintain and do what you can. And it's kind of a nice time in life where you can maybe let go a little bit as a woman. Sometimes as women, we kind of, we're always obsessed with what we eat and trying to stay lean and trying to, like, work harder and faster and run further and all those things. And this is also kind of a nice time when you can maybe let go of some of those obsessions a little bit and just be okay with it.
Yes, true.
and just love your changing body for what it's doing, because it's another difficult thing. It's like your body is changing and you're maybe putting on weight, but that's okay. This is a time when it's okay, and to just kind of love your body for that. I'm a big proponent of body positivity. So yeah. Thank
you so much. That was so good. Thank you. Thank you for coming on to this podcast today. I always get comments, or in my DM inbox, I always get mama who are pregnant and thinking about what they can do in terms of how to just be strong and not get so tired, and what to do to prevent diastasis. So we touched on all of those points today. So that was really good. And I hope whoever you're listening right now, if you find it helpful, please check out Nikki's Instagram at C2 Sky, I believe, right?
Yeah, Sea to Sky Fitness.
C2 Sky Fitness. Yeah, that's where you can find her on her Instagram. And if you're pregnant, definitely go check her out because she has a lot of resources on her Instagram, how to stay fit and healthy while you're pregnant. So that would be really good for you. And I totally believe that if you stay fit and healthy and at least somewhat, right, rather than doing nothing, you are going to be able to mitigate the diastasis recti, or at least not get as worse as it could have. Because culturally, my parents are like, oh, you don't need to exercise while you're pregnant. You need to just eat a lot. You need to gain some weight, right? I think that's the kind of like
mentality.
That mentality in my family. Like, you don't need to do anything. You just need to make sure baby's safe, baby's okay. You need to eat. You need to be fed. So like, fitness was never my thing, and prior to pregnancy, fitness was never my thing neither. At the most, I went to the hot yoga and like maybe some recreational run with my friends, but like that's about it. So I never did any fitness or gym. So when I was pregnant, like fitness was like totally out of the way. So I didn't do anything at all, and I really regretted it. If I had stayed somewhat active and do something at least other than just, I did walk, but not that much. But then probably my diastasis wouldn't have been so bad. So I hope that if you're listening to this episode, you learned something out of this, got some nuggets out of it. If you find this episode useful, please DM me on direct message, Becky Choi _ let me know what you think. And be sure to check out Nikki's Instagram for her wonderful resources and pregnancy tips and whatnot. Thank you so much once again, Nikki. Thank you for having you here on the podcast.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure, Becky. As always.
Okay. Everybody have a good day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.